Abigail Whitaker pressed both hands flat against the side of the stagecoach and screamed for it to stop, but the driver never looked back. She stood in the middle of a dirt road, with nothing but a stolen name on a crumpled letter, and the July sun burning straight through her bonnet. This is the story of a woman who arrived in the wrong town, lost everything in one afternoon, and chose to stand up anyway. If you're new here, subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach left her at noon. No warning, no apology. Just the driver's voice cracking through the July heat like a whip snap. Wheels gone, end of the line, folks. And then the scramble of boots on dry dirt as the other 3 passengers grabbed their bags and walked toward the nearest shade without a single backward glance. Abigail Whitaker did not move. She stood beside the broken coach and looked at what was left of Dust Creek, Montana territory, and she tried to make it fit the image she'd been carrying in her head for 6 weeks. Helena was supposed to be different. Helena had hotels, she'd been told, a courthouse, a church with glass windows, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had paid her train fare, written her 3 careful letters, and promised a house with a proper floor. This was not Helena. This was a single road of sun-bleached storefronts, leaning against each other like exhausted men. A hand-painted sign above the nearest building read, Vane Supply Company. Fair prices, honest goods. A dog lay flat in the middle of the street and didn't lift its head when she walked past. "Excuse me," Abby said, stopping the first person she saw, a woman in a gray apron carrying a flour sack. "Is there a transfer coach to Helena? I was told there would be a transfer." The woman looked at her the way people look at strangers who've made a mistake they don't yet understand. "Next coach through here is Thursday," the woman said. "If it comes. Hasn't been reliable this summer." "Thursday." Abby kept her voice even. "It's Monday." "Yes, ma'am, it is." The woman walked on. Abby turned back to the stagecoach. The driver was already unhitching the horses, moving with the practiced indifference of a man who had left people stranded before and slept fine afterward. She walked up beside him and waited until he looked at her. "My trunk," she said. "It's still on the back." "Yep." "I'll need help getting it down." "Cost you 50 cents. She had 60 cents to her name. She'd counted it twice on the coach, trying not to let the other passengers notice. She handed him the coin, and he lifted her trunk down without ceremony and set it in the road and walked away. She stood with her trunk and her empty water flask and her crumpled letter from Gerald Fitch and tried to think. Think, Abby. You've been in worse than this. She hadn't been, but telling herself so had always helped. She picked up one end of the trunk and began dragging it toward the shade of the nearest porch. It was heavy. Every practical thing she owned was in it, plus 2 books and a tin of tea she'd packed because she'd read that the frontier was short on decent tea. She'd dragged it about 10 feet when she heard the shouting. It came from the far end of the street, rough, angry voices, the kind that came with crowds. Abby stopped dragging and looked up. A group of men in matching canvas dusters had a smaller man backed against the wall of what looked like a feed store. The smaller man was older, raw-boned, with a hat pushed back off his forehead and his hands raised just below his shoulders, not surrendering exactly. More like trying to show he wasn't reaching for anything. "Last time we're asking Emmett," one of the duster men said, loud enough to carry, not caring who heard. "Mr. Vane's offer stands through today. You sign, you walk. You don't sign—" "I ain't signing," the older man said. His voice shook, but not from fear. From the particular fury of a man who has been made afraid enough times that anger has taken over. "My father broke that ground. My boys were born on that land. I ain't signing nothing." The man in the duster took one step forward and hit him. Not a shove. A fist full across the jaw. The older man's head snapped sideways, and he grabbed the wall to stay upright, and the crowd of onlookers on the opposite side of the street took a collective half-step backward and said nothing. Abby's feet were moving before she decided to move them. "Stop that," she said. She was already halfway across the street, her skirt raising dust, her hand pointing at the man in the duster. "Stop that right now." Every head turned. The man in the duster looked at her the way you look at something that has no business being where it is. He was broad-shouldered, pale-eyed, with a jaw like a shelf and a silver badge pinned to his chest that said deputy in raised letters. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I'd strongly suggest you walk back to wherever you came from." "I came from that stagecoach," Abby said, stopping 4 feet from him. Her heart was hammering, but her voice was level. She'd learned years ago that a level voice was worth more than a raised one. "And I just watched you assault a man in broad daylight in front of witnesses. I would like to know on what legal authority." Silence. The deputy blinked. Behind him, one of his companions made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Legal authority," the deputy repeated. "That badge on your chest suggests you represent the law," Abby said. "Which means there are laws that apply to you as well. Assault is still assault in Montana Territory, deputy. Or has Mr. Vane changed that too?" She did not know why she said that last part. She hadn't spoken to anyone in this town for more than 3 minutes. She didn't know who Vane was beyond the sign above the supply store. But the deputy's expression shifted. Something tightened around his eyes, and she knew she'd struck something true. "You're not in Philadelphia anymore, miss," the deputy said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous. "Out here, mercy costs more than bullets. I'd remember that if I were you." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he jerked his head at his companions, and they walked away, their boots raising identical puffs of dust, casual as men who've never once been held accountable for anything. Abby turned to the older man. He was touching his jaw carefully with 2 fingers, testing the damage. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Been better," he said. He looked at her with a kind of exhausted gratitude that she recognized the look of someone who had stopped expecting help and hadn't quite adjusted to receiving it. "Name's Emmett Garfield. That's my feed store." "Abigail Whitaker. I'm just passing through." He gave her a long look. "You sure about that?" She wasn't sure about anything, but she nodded anyway. Martha Pike's boarding house was the second building on the left past the well. The well that Abby noticed had a padlock on it. She stared at the padlock for a full 3 seconds before continuing up the steps. Martha herself answered the door before Abby could knock. She was a woman of maybe 60, built like someone who'd carried heavy things her whole life, and stopped apologizing for her shoulders. Her hair was iron gray, pinned tight. Her eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, not unkind, but not naive either. "I saw you cross the street at Emmett," Martha said by way of greeting. "I did," Abby said. "Thought you were going to get yourself shot." "So did I briefly." Martha looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "I've got a room. $1.50 a week, meals included. Water's extra right now on account of the well situation, which I expect you noticed." "I noticed." "You got money." Abby hesitated for exactly half a second. "I have 10 cents. Martha's expression didn't change. "I've kept women on credit before. Come in." The inside of the boarding house was plain and clean and smelled like pine soap and old wood. 2 other women sat at the kitchen table, one young, maybe 20, with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold despite the heat. One middle-aged with the calloused hands of a laundress and a bruise yellowing along her collarbone. Neither of them looked up. "Sit," Martha said, setting a tin cup on the table. "I'll tell you what you need to know about Dust Creek before you decide whether you're passing through or staying." "I'm passing through," Abby said. "There's a coach Thursday." "There might be," Martha said. She sat down across from Abby. "Or Vane's men might send it another direction, same as they did last month. They control the freight road 2 miles east. If they decide a coach doesn't come through, it doesn't come through." Abby wrapped both hands around the tin cup. The water inside it was warm and tasted of minerals, but she was thirsty enough not to care. "Who is Silas Vane? Owner of the mine up the North Ridge, owner of the supply company, owner of the deputy you just argued with, which is Deputy Holt, who has never in his career arrested anyone Vane wanted free." Martha's voice was factual, flat, without drama. She was reciting a truth she'd repeated enough times that the outrage had worn smooth. He's been buying up land for 2 years. Ranchers, farmers, people whose families settled this valley before Vane was born. He buys some of it fair. The rest he takes through debt. Fake debt, the younger woman at the table said quietly. She still hadn't looked up. My father had a loan with the supply company. Paid every installment. Vane's men came last spring with a ledger that said he owed double. Paper he'd never signed. Sheriff said the paper looked legitimate. Abby set down her cup. You have receipts, proof of your father's payments. The young woman finally looked up. She had dark circles under her eyes and the particular hollow look of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. They were in his desk burned. Silence settled over the table. How does a man like that operate openly? Abby asked. She was thinking out loud more than asking the way she'd always done when trying to untangle something. A corrupt sheriff forged documents, open intimidation. Someone has to be looking the other way. Territorial judge sits in Helena, Martha said. 4-day ride. By the time anyone gets there, Vane's already had time to clean up whatever needs cleaning. She paused. 2 men have tried to go to Helena in the past year. One came back without his horse and wouldn't say why. The other one didn't come back at all. The heat in the room felt different after she said that. Abby looked at her hands on the table and thought about Gerald Fitch and Helena, who was probably still waiting for her, probably beginning to wonder if she'd changed her mind. She thought about Philadelphia, the school where she'd taught primary arithmetic for 11 years, the landlord who'd sold the building to a factory, the cousin who'd taken in her mother, the slow, quiet narrowing of every option, until a classified advertisement in a women's periodical had seemed like the only door left. Respectable woman sought capable of managing household accounts. References required. Passage paid. She had answered 17 such advertisements before Gerald Fitch answered her. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about the padlock on the well. Martha, she said, do you keep accounts for this boarding house? I do. May I look at them? Martha studied her. Why? Because I spent 11 years teaching arithmetic to children who didn't want to learn it, and the only thing that kept me sane was that numbers don't lie. People do. Laws can be bent. Ledgers can be forged. She met Martha's eyes. But a pattern in numbers is hard to hide. And from what you're describing, a pattern is exactly what Silas Vane has left behind. Martha was quiet for a long moment. The sound of the town outside pressed in through the walls. A horse somewhere voices the distant clank of something metallic from the direction of the mine. I'll get the ledgers, Martha said. She was 3 hours into the boarding house accounts when the door opened. She didn't look up immediately. She'd spread Martha's ledgers across the kitchen table alongside the supply receipts Martha had managed to collect from 2 other business owners, and she was building something. A timeline, a pattern, a map of exactly how Silas Vane bled a town dollar by dollar. She had a pencil tucked behind her ear, and another one in her hand, and a third one broken on the floor, and she was in the particular focused stillness she got when she was close to finding something. That's my chair, a man's voice said. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, tall, lean, with a cavalry rider's posture and a jaw that hadn't met a razor in 4 or 5 days. His hat was pushed back. There was dried blood on his left sleeve, not enough to be serious, but enough to be recent. He was looking at her the way she'd been looking at the ledgers, like he was trying to figure out what he was dealing with. Martha said I could use the table, Abby said. She didn't mention company. I'm not company. I'm a guest. She went back to the ledger. There are 3 other chairs. A pause. Then the sound of a chair being pulled out across the room and the creak of it taking weight. Caleb Rourke, he said. Abigail Whitaker. You're the woman who argued with Holt today. Word travels fast. In a town this small, a woman who talks back to a deputy is the most interesting thing to happen since the mine flooded in April. He didn't say it unkindly. More like a man reporting weather. You should know Holt will remember you. Good, Abby said. People should be remembered for their actions. Another pause. Longer this time. What are you doing with Martha's books? He asked. Finding something. Like what? She looked up at him again. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into stillness, not blankness, but the particular quiet of a man who had learned not to let things show unless he chose to. She'd seen that look on soldiers' wives on women who'd buried children. It was the face of someone who had chosen at some point to stop spending energy on feeling things in front of strangers. Silas Vane is inflating supply prices, she said. Not randomly. He raises them in sequence, first the basic grain, then the feed, then the medicine. Slowly enough that each individual increase seems manageable. But compound them over 18 months, and the average family in this valley is spending 40% more than they were on basics alone, which means they're falling behind on land payments, which means they're defaulting, which means Vane's men arrive with a ledger full of numbers that may or may not reflect real debts. She tapped the open page in front of her. The pattern is consistent, deliberate, and there will be a record somewhere, a master ledger that shows the real numbers against the inflated ones. Caleb Rourke looked at the ledger, then he looked at her. That master ledger, he said slowly, would be in Vane's supply office. Almost certainly. Which is locked, and watched, and staffed by men who work for Vane. Yes. And you're suggesting, I'm not suggesting anything yet, Abby said. I'm finding the pattern. Then I'll think about what to do with it. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them flickered in a draft from the door, and for a second, his shadow stretched long across the wall. You're passing through, he said. It wasn't a question. That was the plan. And now. She looked down at the numbers in front of her. She thought about the padlock on the well. She thought about Emmett Garfield's jaw. She thought about the young woman at the table with the burned desk and the hollow eyes. Now I'm thinking Thursday is a long way off, she said. Caleb Rourke said nothing for a moment. Then he reached across the table, not touching her hands or her papers, but pulling a second lamp closer so the light fell better across the ledger she was reading. The supply office has a side window, he said quietly. Faces the alley. Holt doesn't walk that block after 9. Abby looked at him. He looked back at her with that weathered, still face, and something moved behind his eyes. Not quite warmth, not yet. More like recognition. Tell me what you're looking for, he said. Exactly. She told him, and he listened, really listened the way very few people in her life ever had, without interrupting, without correcting, without looking past her shoulder at something he considered more important. He just listened, and when she finished, he nodded once. All right, Caleb Rourke said. Then we start tonight. Outside, the July heat had not broken. The sun was still a burning weight on the roof of Martha Pike's boarding house. Somewhere on the North Ridge, the mine was still running the grind of it, carrying down through the valley like a second heartbeat, low and relentless and owned by one man. Abby pulled the ledger closer and went back to work. And for the first time since the stagecoach had left her in the road, she did not feel stranded. She felt necessary. And in a town that Silas Vane was slowly suffocating, necessary was the most dangerous thing a person could be. They left at 9:15. Caleb went first, moving along the edge of the alley, the way a man moves when he has done something like this before. Not reckless, not slow, just deliberate, every step placed with the quiet economy of someone who has learned that noise is a choice. Abby followed 3 steps behind her skirt, pinned up at the knee, with the 2 spare hairpins Martha had pressed into her hand without being asked, without saying a word, just pressing them into her palm, and looking at her with those creekwater eyes that said, I know what you're doing, and I'm not going to stop you. The supply office had a side window facing the alley, just as Caleb had said. It was latched from the inside, but the latch was old. The kind of old that means the wood around it has swollen and contracted through enough Montana summers that it no longer fits the frame the way it was intended to. Caleb worked the blade of his pocket knife along the seam for 30 seconds, and the window gave. "After you," he said quietly. Abby didn't hesitate. She put both hands on the sill and went through. The inside of the supply office smelled like tallow and sawdust, and something underneath it, something sharp and chemical that she recognized after a moment as the particular smell of fresh ink on new paper. She stood in the dark and let her eyes adjust, and Caleb came through behind her, pulling the window almost shut behind him. "Back shelf," he said very low. "Left side." Vane keeps a second set of books separate from the floor ledgers. Black cover, brass clasp. "You've been in here before," she said. Not an accusation, just a fact she was filing. "Once." He didn't explain further, and she didn't push. She found the shelf, found the books, found the one he'd described, black cover, brass clasp, heavier than it looked, and she carried it to the window where the moonlight came through the gap, and she opened it and began to read. It took her 4 minutes to understand what she was looking at. It took her 2 more to understand why it made her hands go cold. "Caleb," she said. He was beside her immediately. "Look at column 3, she said. "Every entry in column 2 is the price charged to customers. Column 3 is the actual cost to Vane. The difference," she pointed. "He's been marking up medicine by 300%, grain by 60, feed by 80, but that's not the worst of it." She turned 3 pages. Found the section she'd already half predicted from the boarding house ledgers, but seeing it confirmed still knocked the breath out of her. "He's charging interest on debts that were already paid," she said. "These accounts, Garfield, Whitmore, Bell, Harden. Every one of them shows a balance cleared, paid in full. And then on the following page, the same accounts reappear with a new balance, larger, with a note that says adjusted per agreement." She looked up at him. There was no agreement. These men never agreed to anything. He just rewrote the numbers and relied on the fact that they couldn't prove otherwise. Caleb's jaw was tight. "How many?" 19 accounts, that I can see so far." She turned another page and stopped. 20. There's a Bell family on this list twice. "Jonah's family," Caleb said very quietly. "His father Jonas. They've got 40 acres up the East Ridge. Vane's been after that land for 8 months. Abby looked at the number beside the Bell name. The debt listed was 4 times what any reasonable reading of the previous pages suggested the family actually owed. She thought about the young woman at Martha's table, with the hollow eyes, and she realized that young woman might be Jonah Bell's sister, or his cousin, or just one of a dozen people connected to a family being quietly crushed. "I need to copy these," she said. "All of it. Martha has paper. We don't have time tonight." Caleb's voice had changed, gone a half-step quieter, which she was already learning meant sharper. "Someone's coming." She heard it a second after he said it. Footsteps on the boardwalk out front. Unhurried. 1 set, then 2. She closed the ledger. Caleb took it from her hands, slid it back onto the shelf with practiced precision, and in the same motion took her by the elbow and moved her toward the window. Not roughly, but with the absolute certainty of a man who is not asking. They were through the window and into the alley before the front door rattled. Caleb eased the window shut, and they stood pressed against the outer wall in the dark, and did not breathe. Through the thin wood of the wall, she heard Deputy Holt's voice. "Told you to check it every night. I don't care if you're tired." A mumbled response from someone younger. "I don't pay you to be tired," Holt said. "Check the shelves, check the back window, then get out." Abby counted her own heartbeats. She got to 11 before the footsteps inside moved away from the window and toward the front of the building. Caleb's hand was still on her elbow. He waited until the voices faded completely before he moved, and even then he took them 2 streets over before he slowed down and let go of her arm. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands weren't, but it was dark enough that he couldn't see that. "We need to go back tomorrow night. I need at least 2 hours with those books." "Holt's changing his routine," Caleb said. "That check wasn't scheduled. Someone told him to tighten up." Someone saw us earlier, you think? I think someone saw you earlier. You argued with Holt in the middle of the street and then disappeared into Martha's house with a stranger's ledgers. He paused. You're not easy to overlook, Miss Whitaker. She couldn't tell in the dark if that was a compliment. She decided to treat it as information. Then we go back the night after. I'll work faster. He looked at her for a moment. You're not afraid. I'm very afraid, she said. I've just had a great deal of practice appearing otherwise. Morning came the way it always did in July, sudden and merciless, the heat arriving before the light had fully settled. Abby was already at Martha's kitchen table, before anyone else was awake, working from memory, writing down every number she could recall from Vane's second ledger in the careful columns she'd been building since the night before. She had a good memory for numbers. She always had. Her mother used to say it was a gift and a burden simultaneously, because a woman who remembered every figure also remembered every broken promise, every miscalculated kindness, every sum that didn't add up. She was halfway through her third column when the kitchen door opened and a boy came in. He was maybe 15, thin in the way of boys who work hard and don't eat enough, with a gap in his front teeth and eyes that moved fast around a room the way eyes do when a person has learned to read danger in the position of other people's bodies. He stopped when he saw Abby and looked at Martha, who had appeared behind him. This is Jonah Bell, Martha said. He helps with the horses out back. Jonah, this is Miss Whitaker. Ma'am, Jonah said. He looked at the papers on the table. Are those numbers about Vane? Abby looked at him carefully. Why do you ask? Because my pa has been trying to get someone to look at his account for 6 months, and nobody will. He said it without self-pity, just a flat statement of fact, the way children report injustice before they've learned that adults find it uncomfortable to hear. His handwriting is bad, so he can't write it down good himself. And the lawyer Vane brought into town, he ain't a real lawyer. Pa looked him up. There's no record of him being licensed anywhere in the territory. Abby set down her pencil. Jonah, sit down. He sat. Tell me everything your father has told you about his account with Vane's supply company. Every detail you can remember. Start at the beginning. He talked for 40 minutes. She wrote for 40 minutes. By the end, she had 2 more pages of numbers and 3 new pieces of information she hadn't had before. The fake lawyer's name was a man called Purdy. He had arrived in Dust Creek exactly 2 months before Vane began his most aggressive round of debt collection, and Jonas Bell had been keeping his own records, rough ones, written in a ledger he kept hidden under the floorboards of the barn, because he didn't trust the house after the fire that had taken Emmett Garfield's desk. Can you get me your father's ledger? Abby asked. He won't like it, Jonah said. He don't like strangers having our family papers. I understand that completely, Abby said. Tell him I'm not taking them anywhere. I just want to compare them against what I've already found. 2 sets of numbers. If they match, we have something we can take to a judge. Jonah chewed on that for a moment. You know a judge? I know what judges need to see, she said. It's different, but it's a start. He nodded, slowly stood, and went back out the door. Martha watched him go, and then looked at Abby with an expression that was carefully neutral. He's a good boy, Martha said. His father is a proud man. Proud men are slow to accept help. I know, Abby said. I've spent 11 years teaching children whose fathers were too proud to admit they couldn't help with the arithmetic. Martha almost smiled. It was a narrow thing, that almost smile, but it was there. Caleb came back at midday with his old wound bleeding through his shirt sleeve and Jonas Bell's ledger under his arm. Abby saw him from across the room and was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. What happened? Nothing serious. He set the ledger on the table and pressed his hand over the sleeve in a way that suggested it was at least somewhat serious. Vane's men were at the Bell place when I got there, 2 of them, talking to Jonas about his signature on a document that Jonas says he never signed. I interrupted the conversation. You fought them. I encouraged them to leave. He sat down in the nearest chair with the careful deliberateness of a man managing pain. They left. Where is Jonas? Staying at the Bell place with Jonah. He didn't want to go, stubborn man. Something that might have been respect moved across Caleb's face. Good man, though. He knew exactly which floorboard the ledger was under. Abby was already at the supply closet where Martha kept a box of clean linen for exactly the kinds of situations that arose in a town with no reliable doctor. She came back with a strip of cotton and sat down across from him. Roll up your sleeve, she said. He looked at her. I spent 2 years helping the school nurse in Philadelphia before I taught my own classroom, she said. Roll it up. He rolled up his sleeve. The wound was a reopened cut old enough to have tried to heal and new enough to still be angry. She cleaned it without comment, working quickly and efficiently, and he sat without complaint, which told her he had a high tolerance for pain or a great deal of practice pretending he did. Caleb, she said without looking up from her work. How do you know that office so well? The shelf, the latch, the ledger location. A pause. I used to work for Vane, he said. She did look up then. His expression was the same careful, still face, but something underneath it was different. The particular tension of a man who has said something he can't unsay and has decided to live with the consequences. Scouting, he said. 2 years ago, I was between ranches and Vane needed someone who knew the terrain north of the ridge. I didn't know what he was building at the time, not fully. I had suspicions, but I needed the work. He paused. By the time I understood it completely, I had a ranch of my own, and he had a record of my cooperation that he could use against me if I moved against him. Abby held his gaze. He's been keeping you quiet. He's been keeping me quiet, Caleb said, until about 10 hours ago when I put his men off Jonas Bell's property, so I expect the arrangement is now effectively over. You knew about the second ledger. I saw him use it once, 2 years ago. I didn't understand what I was seeing at the time. His voice was flat, but it had the particular flatness of a man who has spent 2 years understanding exactly what he should have done differently. I understand it now. Abby tied off the bandage. She sat back and looked at him. Really looked at him the way she hadn't let herself do yet, because there hadn't been time, and because she'd learned long ago that really looking at people was dangerous. It made you care about what happened to them. He'll come after you now, she said. Most likely. Your ranch. My ranch has a clean water spring on it, Caleb said. It's the last one in the valley that Vane doesn't control. He's been wanting it for a year. I expect now he'll stop being patient about it. He said it the way you say something you've already fully processed. That's fine. I'd rather fight him openly than keep my head down and watch what he does to this valley. She looked at him for one more moment. All right, she said, and she opened Jonas Bell's ledger and put it next to her own copied columns and got back to work. It was Martha who brought the worst news. She came into the kitchen at 3 in the afternoon with a face that had gone carefully blank, the blankness of someone controlling something large, and she sat down and waited until Jonah had been sent out on an errand before she spoke. Purdy was at the well this morning, she said. The fake lawyer. He had a new document, a petition he called it, signed by 12 residents asking the territorial court to formally recognize Vane's claim over the water rights to the Valley Well and the North Spring. Abby's pencil stopped. The 12 residents who signed, she said. Did anyone see the petition? Emmett Garfield saw it for about 30 seconds before Purdy took it back. He said 3 of the names on it were men who have been dead for over a year. Martha's voice was completely flat. Filed as living residents of Dust Creek Valley. Dead men's signatures. Abby set down her pencil very carefully. She looked at Caleb. He was already looking at her. If that petition reaches the territorial court before we do, she said, Vane gets legal recognition of those water rights. And once he controls the well and your spring, every family in this valley either sells or dies of thirst, Caleb said. Yes. How fast can that petition reach Helena? She asked Martha. Purdy left this afternoon with a horse, Martha said. I had Billy Marsh watch him go. He took the east road. 4 days to Helena, Caleb said. 3 if he pushes the horse, Martha said. Purdy doesn't look like a man who cares about horses. 3 days. Abby did the calculation the way she always did, quickly, practically, without letting the fear of the answer slow down the arithmetic. They needed to reach Helena before Purdy. They needed evidence strong enough to override a document with 12 signatures, 3 of which were forgeries. They needed a judge who was not already in Vane's pocket, which was not a guaranteed thing, and they needed to get there without Vane's men stopping them on the East Road. "There's a second route north," Caleb said, reading her expression with a precision that she was beginning to find both useful and slightly unnerving. "Longer, harder. But Vane doesn't watch it because it goes through the dry country, and most people won't risk the water shortage." "We have water if we plan well," Abby said. "We have 2 days to copy every relevant document from Vane's office," Caleb said. "Then we ride." Martha stood up from the table. She went to the shelf above the stove and took down a tin that rattled when she moved it. She set it on the table in front of Abby. $23, she said. "My emergency money. It's yours." Martha. "It's not a gift," Martha said firmly. "It's an investment. You bring back federal marshals, I'll want it back with interest." The narrow, almost smile again briefly. "Now, what else do you need?" They went back to the supply office the following night and the night after that. The second night, Abby copied for 2 hours and 7 minutes, by the count of Caleb's pocket watch, working in near darkness, her handwriting smaller and faster than she'd ever written in a classroom. Compressing months of fraud onto 12 sheets of paper that she folded into the lining of her second petticoat, because it was the one place she was certain no man in this territory would think to search. The third night was when it went wrong. She had just finished the last column, the one connecting Purdy's name to a law office in St. Louis that, according to a notice she'd found, pressed between 2 pages of the master ledger, had been closed by the Missouri Bar for fraud in 1873, when the door at the front of the supply office opened, not the rattle of a routine check, a key in a lock. Deliberate. Expected. Caleb was across the room in 2 steps. His hand found her wrist in the dark, and he pulled her toward the window, but she could already hear a second set of footsteps from the alley outside. Someone had thought to cover the exit. She pressed her back against the shelf and did not breathe, and felt Caleb position himself between her and the front of the room. She could feel the decision in his body, the specific quality of stillness that precedes action. "I know you're in here." The voice was new. Smooth, well-fed, the voice of a man who had not been afraid of anything in a long time. "Come out where I can see you, and we can have a civilized conversation, Mr. Rourke. I've been wanting one for a while." Silas Vane had come himself. Caleb's hand pressed back against Abby's armstay. She stayed. "I don't recall being invited," Caleb said. His voice was completely calm. "This is my building," Vane said. "The invitation is standing. Come out." A lamp flared at the front of the room. Abby pressed herself smaller against the shelf and looked through the gap between 2 large boxes at the man who owned Dust Creek. Silas Vane was not what she'd expected. He was maybe 50 trim in a dark coat that hadn't been bought in any territory store. He wore no gun on his hip. He didn't need to. Deputy Holt stood 2 steps behind him, and Holt's hand rested on his holster with the ease of long habit. "The woman, too," Vane said. "Miss Whitaker, I know she's here." A beat of silence. Then Caleb stepped forward into the lamplight. Abby, after a half-second calculation that confirmed she had no better option, stepped out beside him. Vane looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is mildly impressed and deeply annoyed simultaneously. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been reading," she said. "Your books are fascinating." Something moved in his eyes. Not anger, colder than anger. "What you've been doing is theft, Miss Whitaker, of private business documents." "What I've been doing," she said, "is reading numbers that have been used to defraud 19 families in this valley of their land and their livelihood. Reading isn't theft, Mr. Vane, even in Montana territory." Vane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are the copies?" "I don't know what you mean. The papers you've made. The columns you've written." They're not in this room, and they're not in Martha Pike's house because I had my men search it this afternoon while she was at the well." He paused. "Mrs. Pike is fine before you worry. I'm a businessman, not a savage." Martha's house had been searched. The thought of Martha coming home to find her rooms turned over lit something cold and hard in Abby's chest. But Vane was looking at her with calculating eyes, and she kept her face exactly neutral. "There are no copies," she said. "We didn't have time." It was the most important lie she had ever told. She felt it leave her mouth with the particular clarity of something she would live with regardless of how it landed. Vane studied her, studied Caleb. His expression shifted the slight loosening of a man who has decided he's won. "Then there's no harm done," he said. He stepped back and gestured toward the window. "Go back to Martha's. Leave Dust Creek on Thursday's coach. And Miss Whitaker." He paused at the door. "I'd suggest you wire your Mr. Fitch in Helena and tell him you've changed your mind. You're not suited for this country." He left. Holt followed. The lamp went with them. The room was dark again. Abby stood very still until the footsteps outside faded completely. Then she reached down and pressed one hand flat against her skirt, feeling through the fabric the faint crinkle of 12 sheets of paper folded into the lining of her petticoat. "He thinks we failed," Caleb said very quietly. "Yes," she said. "He'll watch us until Thursday." "Yes. So we can't leave Thursday." "No," she agreed. "We leave tomorrow, before dawn, through the dry country north." She turned to look at him in the dark. "There's one more thing, Caleb. Vane said you're Mr. Fitch in Helena." She paused. "Gerald Fitch, the man I was traveling to marry. His name appears in that ledger, in the supply account. He's made 3 payments to Vane's company in the past 6 months." The silence between them had a particular weight. "You think he's connected to Vane," Caleb said. "I think 3 payments of that size to a man operating a fraud scheme in a valley the payer has never visited is not a coincidence." She kept her voice flat, because the alternative, the full implications of what it meant that she had traveled 2,000 miles toward a man who might be complicit in everything around her, was something she would process later when there was time. "It doesn't change what we need to do. It just means Helena may not be as safe as we thought." She heard Caleb breathe in slowly. "All right," he said, the same 2 words he'd used the first night sitting across Martha's kitchen table. But this time they sounded different, heavier, more deliberate, like a man choosing a direction knowing exactly what the road looks like. "All right," he said again. "Then we ride at 4. He was already moving toward the window when she caught his arm. "Caleb." She waited until he turned. "He said your name like he knew exactly where you were, like he expected you'd be here." She paused. "Is there anyone who knew about tonight besides us and Martha?" In the dark, she watched him think. Watched his face change slowly, the way a man's face changes when he lands on an answer he doesn't want. "Jonah," he said. Jonah knew, and somewhere across town, in the direction of the boarding house, a single lamp was burning in a window that had been dark when they left. They ran. Not the panicked running of people who have lost, the purposeful, controlled running of people who know exactly how much time they have and what they intend to do with it. Caleb went through the alley window first this time, reaching back to steady Abby as she came through, and they moved through the dark in the direction of Martha's boarding house without speaking, because there was nothing to say, yet nothing that wouldn't wait until they knew what they were walking back into. The lamp in the window was still burning. Caleb stopped at the corner of the street and put his hand out to stop her too. He looked at the window for a long moment without moving, the way a man looks at something he's trying to read. "Could be Martha," Abby said quietly. "Martha goes to bed at 9, he said. She told me that first week I boarded here. Said any trouble that comes after 9 deserves to wait until morning." "Then it's not Martha." "No," he said. "It's not." They went in through the back. Jonah was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the wood in front of him, and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere between the table surface and the floor. He looked up when they came through the door, and what Abby saw in his face was not guilt. Exactly, guilt was a simpler thing. Smaller, more self-contained. What she saw was the particular devastation of a person who has made an impossible choice and already understands that no version of it was right. "Jonah," Caleb said, very quiet, very still. "He had my paw," Jonah said. The words came out flat and fast, like he'd been rehearsing them and didn't want to stop now that he'd started. "Holt and 2 other men. They came to the farm this morning before I left. They had my paw by the collar, and Holt had his gun out, and Mr. Vane—" His voice cracked, and he steadied it through sheer force. "Mr. Vane told me he'd shoot my father right there in the barn and tell everyone it was an accident and there wasn't a person in Dust Creek who'd say any different. And he looked at my paw and he said, 'You know that's true, don't you?' Jonas and my pa said—" Jonah stopped. "My pa said yes." The kitchen was silent. "He asked me where you were going tonight," Jonah said. "And I told him." He looked at Caleb directly. The way people look at someone when they need to be honest, and they know it's going to cost them. "I'm sorry. I didn't see another way." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Abby had time to watch his face work through several things. Anger, she thought first. Then understanding. Then something sadder and more complicated than either. "Your pa's alive," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "Then you did what you had to do." Caleb's voice was flat and final, the kind of flat that wasn't cold, but was finished. "Get up, go back to the farm and stay with your father. Don't come back to town until I tell you it's safe." Jonah stood. He looked at Abby with an expression that was asking for something she wasn't sure she could give yet. Absolution maybe, or at least acknowledgement that the choice had been real, had been truly impossible, had not just been cowardice wearing a better face. She met his eyes. "Take the back road," she said. "Go now." He nodded once and went out the back door and was gone. Martha appeared in the doorway from the hall fully dressed, despite the hour, with her iron-gray hair still pinned and her hands braced against the doorframe, like a woman who has been listening for exactly as long as she needed to and has drawn her own conclusions. "They're coming tonight," she said. Not a question. "Almost certainly," Abby said. "Then we have about 40 minutes. Martha moved to the shelf above the stove, methodical and unhurried, pulling things down the tin, with the $23 a folded document that turned out to be the deed to the boarding house. "I've been in this town for 14 years. I've watched 6 families lose everything, and I've listened to myself tell them it'll get better, and I've been wrong every time." She set both items on the table. "Tonight, I'd like to be useful." "Martha," Abby started. "Don't argue with me, Abigail. I'm 62 years old and I'm tired of arguments." She looked at Caleb. "What do you need?" What they needed was time, and they didn't get it. Vane's men came in 30 minutes instead of 48 of them. Holt at the front, with a piece of paper he held up before he even knocked, like the paper itself was a weapon, which in this territory it effectively was. "Warrant for the arrest of one Caleb Rourke," Holt said when Martha opened the door. "On charges of trespass, assault, and theft of private documents. That warrant," Martha said, "is signed by the territorial sheriff in Helena." "It's signed by Sheriff Briggs," Holt said. "Sheriff Briggs, who works for Silas Vane," Martha said. "Sheriff Briggs, who is the duly appointed law of this county," Holt said. He smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you step aside." Martha did not step aside. She stood in the doorway of her own boarding house for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds in which Abby, watching from the hallway, understood that Martha Pike had been waiting a very long time to not step aside and was savoring it. Then Holt put his hand on her shoulder and moved her. Caleb was in the kitchen. He'd had 30 minutes, and he'd spent them doing 3 things: sending word to Emmett Garfield, through a window, confirming the location of the mine's eastern tunnel exit with a man named Foster, who had worked Vane's mine for a year before being fired, and tying the second copy of Abby's documents, the one she'd made from memory on her first night with Martha's ledgers, into the lining of his saddlebag, and hiding the bag under the floorboards of the back room. The documents on Abby's person, remained on Abby's person. When Holt and his men came through the hall, Caleb was standing at the kitchen table with his hands visible and his face composed, and Abby was standing across from him with her own hands folded in front of her and her chin level. "Mr. Rourke," Holt said, "you're coming with us." "On what specific charge?" Abby asked. "Miss Whitaker," Holt said without looking at her. "I would very much appreciate it if you would stay quiet. Trespass would require proof of presence." She continued exactly as if he hadn't spoken. "Assault would require a complainant. Theft of private documents would require proof that documents were taken, which would mean producing those documents in court, which Mr. Vane has indicated he'd prefer not to do." She paused. "What you actually have is a piece of paper signed by a man who takes his salary from the person ordering this arrest. That's not a warrant. That's a note." Every man in the room was looking at her now. Holt's jaw had a rigidity to it that suggested he was exercising significant self-control. "Take him," Holt said to the men behind him. Two of them moved toward Caleb. He didn't resist. She'd told him not to 30 minutes ago because a man who resists an armed arrest in the middle of the night in a town where the law is owned by one man does not improve his situation by resisting. He only gives them a reason to hurt him and call it justifiable. He'd listened to her with the same focused attention he always gave her, and he'd said all right, and he'd meant it. But at the door, he stopped. He turned and looked at her across the kitchen over the heads of Holt's men, and in his face was everything the past 3 days had built between them. Not a speech, not a declaration, just the clear communication of a man who has decided to trust someone completely and is aware that it is an irreversible decision. "Abby," he said. "Just her name." "I know," she said. And she did. They took him out. Silas Vane came himself at 8 the next morning. He came alone, which was its own kind of statement. The statement of a man who knows he doesn't need backup in a room with 2 women and an old feed store owner. He came with a cup of coffee from his own supply store, which he set on Martha's kitchen table without being invited, and he sat down across from Abby, and he looked at her with those cold, calculating eyes that saw everything in terms of cost and leverage. "I want the copies," he said. "There are no copies," Abby said, for the second time. The lie had not gotten easier to tell, but she'd had 11 years of practice keeping her face neutral in front of people who were testing her. "Miss Whitaker." His voice was patient, almost gentle. "I'm going to give you something that I very rarely give anyone. I'm going to give you a choice." He folded his hands on the table. "You can give me the copies you've made of my business records. In return, Caleb Rourke walks out of my mind by sundown today. You take the Thursday coach to Helena. You marry your Mr. Fitch, who I understand is a reasonable and prosperous man, and you spend the rest of your life in a comfortable house far away from Dust Creek Valley." He paused. "Or you can keep the copies. And Caleb Rourke spends the next 6 months underground in my mind while I build a legal case against him that I promise you will take years to untangle, even if you do eventually reach someone in Helena who will listen. And the families in this valley," another pause longer, more deliberate, "will run out of water before that happens." The kitchen was very still. "How long?" Abby said carefully. "Until you control the last clean water spring." "That's Mr. Rourke's spring," Vane said. "I expect it to transfer to my possession within the week one way or another. And then the valley has one water source. Mine." He picked up his coffee cup. "I'm a businessman, Miss Whitaker. Not a monster. I'll sell water at a fair price." "The same fair price you charge for grain and medicine," she said. Something very small shifted in his expression. Not anger. She was beginning to think Silas Vane did not operate in anger, only in calculation. 24 hours, he said. He stood. "Caleb Rourke walks out of my mind tomorrow at sundown, or he goes deeper in. The choice is yours." He left. Martha, who had been standing in the doorway the entire time, came to the table and sat down slowly, as if her legs had decided to defer the weight for a moment. "He believes there are no copies," she said. "He believes there might not be," Abby said. "That's why he's offering the trade instead of just taking. He's not certain." She spread her hands flat on the table. Which means we have 24 hours, and one advantage: he doesn't know exactly what we have. We can't outrun him, Martha said. Not with his men on the roads. No, Abby agreed. We can't run yet. She was already thinking the way she thought through arithmetic, starting with what was known and working toward what wasn't. But we can get Caleb out of that mine before he has time to move him deeper. And if we get Caleb out, we ride tonight, before dawn, the dry country route north. To get Caleb out, Martha said, you'd need to go through Vane's mine. I know. With guards. I know. Abigail. Martha's voice was careful. You can't do this alone. No, Abby said. She looked at Emmett Garfield, who had been sitting at the far end of the table in silence since before Vane arrived, who had come through the window in the dark last night, when Caleb's word reached him, who had a jaw still carrying the yellow of Holt's fist and hadn't once complained about it. I can't, but I don't intend to. She spent 4 hours rebuilding what Caleb had started. She talked to Emmett, who knew the mine's physical layout from 2 years of hauling freight to the entrance. She talked to Foster, the ex-miner, who knew the eastern tunnel and its exit point, and the shift rotation of Vane's guards, because men who've been wrongfully fired carry a detailed memory of the place that wronged them. She talked to 3 ranchers' wives who had been meeting quietly in the back of the church every Sunday for 6 months, because they had nowhere else to go and nothing else left to do with their rage, and who turned out to be the most practically clear-headed people Abby had spoken to since arriving in Dust Creek. Because women who have been afraid for a long time learn to think inside the fear instead of around it. And she talked to Jonah Bell, who came back into town at noon with his father, Jonas walking beside him. Jonas Bell moving with the stiff dignity of a man who has decided that getting shot at in his own barn is the last time he's going to let Silas Vane dictate where he goes. I owe Rourke, Jonas Bell said. He was a big man, raw-boned like his son, but with 20 years more weathering. He came off my property twice in the past week. Ain't a lot of men who do that. We need someone who can move fast and knows the ground between town and the mine entrance, Abby said. That's me, Jonah said immediately. Jonah, his father started. Pa. Jonah looked at his father with the particular clarity of a boy who has crossed the line into something older. I already made one wrong choice. I'm not making another one. Jonas Bell looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked at Abby. What do you need? The eastern tunnel exit is behind the ridge, she said. Foster says it's been blocked with timber since April. Vane had it sealed when he laid off the eastern crew. It can be cleared from outside. That's your job. You and 2 other men starting after dark, as quiet as possible. She looked at Jonas directly. Can you do that? We can do that, he said. His voice was rock solid, the voice of a man who had been talked into too many corners too many times and was done with corners. Abby nodded. She looked around the room at the people assembled in Martha's kitchen. Emmett, Foster, Jonas. Jonah, the 3 ranchers' wives, Martha herself, and she felt the particular weight of standing at the center of something that was too large for any one person and had started moving anyway. Tonight, she said, we have one chance. No. The thunderstorm came at 11, rolling in off the mountains, the way Montana storms did in July. Without preamble, without warning, the sky simply deciding it was done, pretending. Abby had been watching for it since 8. Foster had said the summer storms that came off the North Ridge created so much noise on the mine's tin roof sheds that the guards moved inside the main entrance and left the eastern approach effectively unmonitored for the duration. It was the only time. It was the right time. Emmett set fire to the hay yard at 11:15. He didn't enjoy it. She'd seen his face when she asked him the brief closing of his eyes that was a man mourning something before he agreed to it because it was his own hay. The last of the summer supply, and hay in a drought was as close to gold as anything in Dust Creek Valley. But he'd said all right, and meant it the same 2 words Caleb had used, and she was beginning to understand that all right in this valley had come to mean something larger than agreement. It meant I'm choosing this fully with both eyes open, knowing what it costs. The fire pulled Holt and 3 of his men away from the mine entrance before midnight. Abby Foster and the youngest of the 3 ranchers' wives, a woman named Clara Marsh, who was 28, and had been described to Abby as someone who had never once in her life been where she was supposed to be, went in through the eastern approach in the gap between 2 rolls of thunder. The tunnel was low earth-smelling, supported by timber frames that Foster navigated with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent 2 years of his life underground. Abby moved behind him with one hand on the timber to her left and the other holding the covered lamp that gave them a 3-foot circle of usable light. Clara came behind, moving with the specific silent efficiency of a woman who had been told most of her life that she was reckless and had decided that the label was a compliment. They found Caleb 20 minutes in. He was in a side chamber off the main tunnel. Not a cell exactly, just a space that had a lock on the exterior, and Holt's second deputy sitting outside it on a wooden crate. The deputy was young, heavy-lidded from the heat and the noise of the storm, and he heard nothing until Foster's hand closed over his collar from behind. And Clara took the lamp from Abby and held it steady, and Abby crouched down in front of the deputy and said very quietly, "Don't, please. I have no interest in hurting you. Tell me where the key is." The deputy, to his credit, thought about it for a full 3 seconds. Then the thunder rolled again, and Caleb hit the interior of the locked door hard enough to make the frame shudder, and the deputy pointed at his belt. Abby took the key. Caleb came through this door, the way a man comes through a door when he's been locked in a small, dark space for 14 hours, fast, fully alert, scanning the space in front of him before he'd even fully straightened. He looked at Foster, at Clara, at Abby, and his expression moved through relief and something warmer and more complicated before it settled back into the focused calm she recognized. "The saddlebag," she said immediately. "Under the backroom floor. We need—" "I know," he said. "We're not going back to Martha's. Then we ride with what I have." "What do you have?" She pressed one hand flat against her skirt. He understood. He nodded once. "Then we ride," he said. They went back through the tunnel the way they'd come. Foster first, then Abby, then Clara, then Caleb, and they were 30 feet from the eastern exit when the shooting started. It came from outside. Not from behind them, from the direction of the tunnel exit, where Jonas Bell and Jonah and 2 other men had been clearing the blocked timber for the past 2 hours. Clara stopped moving. Abby ran into Foster's back. "Get down," Caleb said from behind her. His hand found her shoulder and pressed, and she went down to one knee without arguing, and the tunnel around them swallowed the echo of gunfire and gave it back, amplified and wrong. It stopped. 3 shots and then silence. The silence was worse than the shots. They moved forward through it fast, now no longer careful about noise, and came through the exit into the wet, thunderstruck dark. And Abby looked and found Jonas Bell. He was on the ground. Jonah was on his knees beside him. The 2 other men were pressed against the rock on the far side of the exit, one of them bleeding from the arm, both of them alive. Jonah looked up when Abby reached them, and his face in the lightning was the face of a boy who has just crossed into a country there's no returning from. "Pa," he said. Just that. One word carrying everything. Abby went to her knees in the wet dirt beside Jonas Bell and put her hands on his chest and felt the particular stillness that told her what she needed to know and did not want to know. She looked at Jonah. "Jonah," she said. Her voice was steady because she made it steady because he needed someone in front of him to be steady. "Your father is gone. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry." Jonah made a sound that wasn't a word. Caleb was beside him in the same moment, one hand on the boy's back, not saying anything because there was nothing to say. From somewhere on the far side of the ridge, voices, getting closer. "We have to move," Foster said. "I'm not leaving him," Jonah said. "We won't," Caleb said. "Emmett." He looked at the 2 men against the rock. "You and Hardened take him. There's a root cellar behind Martha's, you know the one." The older man nodded. "Take him there. Keep Jonah with you." "Jonah comes with us," Abby said. "Abby, he comes with us," she said. She looked at Jonah. "You heard every conversation at that table. You know exactly what evidence we're carrying and what it proves and how to explain it to a judge. If something happens to us, you're the testimony." She held his gaze. "Do you understand?" Jonah Bell looked at his father one more time. Something in his face made the decision something final and aching and very quiet, the way real decisions are actually made, not in great dramatic moments, but in small, exhausted acceptances. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Then get up," she said. "We ride in 3 minutes." The storm was still moving overhead loud enough to cover horses, if they moved fast, wet enough to obscure tracks on the ground. Caleb had known where the horses were, had told Foster 2 days ago, thinking ahead in the way of a man who plans escapes, the way other men plan breakfasts, practically without drama. They reached the horses. Caleb checked the saddlebag on his own animal and found it empty. Holt's men had gotten there first, had found the copy he'd hidden, and taken it. Which meant what Abby carried on her person was the only surviving record of everything Silas Vane had done to Dust Creek Valley. 12 sheets of paper folded into the lining of a petticoat 2,000 miles from Philadelphia in the middle of a Montana thunderstorm. "It's enough," Abby said when Caleb told her. She was already mounted. "I know what's on those pages. I wrote every word." He looked at her from the back of his horse in the rain, and for a moment with the storm moving overhead and Jonah mounting behind her and the voices from the ridge getting louder, he looked at her the way he'd looked at her across Martha's kitchen table that first night, with that careful, still face, and something moving behind it that was not cautious at all. "Abigail Whitaker," he said. "Don't," she said. "Tell me later. Ride now." He rode, and behind them Silas Vane's voice rose above the storm on the ridge, loud, controlled, certain, giving orders to men who did not know yet that the thing they were trying to stop was already gone, already moving north through the dark toward the dry country and the territorial judge in Helena, and the specific catastrophic reckoning that 12 sheets of paper could bring to a man who had spent 2 years believing that the only record that mattered was the one he controlled. He was wrong, and Abigail Whitaker riding north into the rain, with the evidence pressed against her skin, and a grieving boy at her back, and a wounded cowboy at her side, was going to prove it. The rain stopped before dawn. 1 hour they had the storm covering their tracks, and the noise of their horses, and then the sky simply closed up, and left them in the particular heavy silence that follows. Montana thunder, wet ground, no wind, and the first gray light beginning to press against the eastern edge of everything. Caleb pushed the horses harder. Jonah rode without speaking. He had not spoken since they'd left the mine, and Abby didn't push him because there was nothing she could give him right now that would be adequate, and she'd learned long ago that offering inadequate things to grieving people was a form of selfishness. It made the giver feel useful and left the receiver more alone. So she let him be quiet, and she watched the back trail, and she kept her hand pressed flat against her skirt, every few miles feeling the crinkle of paper through the fabric, reassuring herself that the 12 sheets were still there, still real, still worth what Jonas Bell had paid. They rode for 6 hours before Caleb slowed. "We need water," he said. His voice was level, but she'd been watching him for the past hour, and she'd seen the way he held his left arm slightly away from his body, the way a person holds an injured thing when they're trying not to advertise it. "How bad is it?" she asked. "It's fine." Caleb. "It's manageable," he said, which she was learning meant somewhere between fine and serious, Jonah said, without looking up from his horse's neck. "There's a spring about 2 miles east of the trail. My pa showed me once. Said it was the kind of place you keep to yourself, because the moment you tell people about clean water, they stop being careful with it." He paused. "I reckon he'd want me to use it." Neither Abby nor Caleb said anything for a moment. "Lead us there," Caleb said finally, quietly. Jonah led. The spring was real cold and clean, and hidden in a rock depression that you'd ride past 100 times without seeing if you didn't know to look. They watered the horses and filled their flasks, and Abby sat beside Caleb while he let her look at his arm, without arguing, which told her more about his condition than the arm itself did. The wound had opened again during the mine tunnel. She could see it through the dark stain on his sleeve, and she unwrapped it and rewrapped it with a strip of her underskirt that she tore off without ceremony, while he watched her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You could have told me earlier," she said. "Wasn't slowing us down." "It was going to." "Not yet," he said. "There's a difference." She tied the bandage tighter than was comfortable. He didn't flinch. "You were going to wait until you fell off your horse to mention it." "I've never fallen off a horse. There's a first time for everything." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one the place where a smile would be if he let it. "You're bossy," he said. "I spent 11 years managing 30 children at a time," she said. "Bossy is a professional qualification." The shadow smile stayed for a moment longer than she expected. Then he looked out at the trail, and the moment passed back into the focused, practical stillness she'd come to rely on. "2 days to Helena at this pace," he said. "Vane's men will be on the main road. We stay dry country as long as we can, then cut east when we hit the Flathead River. And if they're watching the river crossing, then we deal with that when it happens." "That's not a plan," she said. "It's the plan we have," he said. "Sometimes that's enough." She looked at him, really looked the way she'd been allowing herself to do more frequently over the past 3 days in the spaces between crises. He was looking at the horizon, and his profile had that weathered, careful quality that she'd first read as distance and had slowly come to understand was something different. Not distance. Discipline. The particular discipline of a man who has learned that showing what he feels costs more than he can afford in a life that had already taken more than its share. "Caleb," she said, "after this is done, whatever happens in Helena—" She stopped. "Yeah," he said. Not what not go on. Just yeah, like he already knew the shape of what she was trying to say and was giving her room to not have to say all of it. "I don't know what my life looks like," she said. "I came west for one reason, and that reason is complicated. I don't have a plan past the judge." "Neither do I," he said. "My ranch is most likely in Vane's hands by the time we get back. I'm sorry. Don't be." He looked at her then, direct and uncomplicated. "I'd rather lose the ranch fighting than keep it staying quiet. Took me 2 years to figure that out." A pause. "You helped." She held his gaze. "I argued with a deputy in the middle of the street 20 minutes after arriving in your town." "Yeah," he said. "That's what helped." Jonah made a sound that might, under other circumstances, have been a laugh. It wasn't a laugh now, but it was something, a small acknowledgement that the world still contained moments with more than one quality to them, even now, even here. "Let's ride," Jonah said, and he stood and went to his horse, and they followed. Vane's men found them at the river, not at the crossing. Caleb had avoided the main ford and taken them a mile south to a shallower place where the water ran fast and noisy over flat rock, the kind of crossing that punished horses but left no easy trail on the far bank. They were halfway across when the riders appeared on the ridge above the south bank. 4 of them, not Holt. Holt would be managing Dust Creek, managing the story, filing whatever paperwork Vane needed, filed to make everything that had happened look legal and contained. These were working men hired for their willingness to ride hard and ask nothing, and they had the particular purposeful stillness of men who've been told what they're looking for and what to do when they find it. "Keep moving," Caleb said very low. "They've seen us," Abby said. "I know. Keep moving." The horses churned through the shallows. Jonah was already on the far bank, turning to look back. Abby pressed her horse forward through the current, feeling the pull of the water against her skirt, feeling the paper shift against her skin, and holding herself absolutely still inside the fear, because panic on a horse in fast water was how people drowned. She made the far bank. Behind her, the 4 riders were coming down the ridge. Caleb was last across. His horse stumbled on the rocky bottom, and for one terrible second, he lurched sideways in the saddle. The injured arm. She thought the balance thrown, and then he caught himself and straightened and came up out of the water onto the bank and turned his horse in one motion. "Jonah," he said, "take the North Fork. Hard as the horse can go. Don't stop." "You're not—" Jonah started. "I'm right behind you." He looked at Abby. "Go with him." "Caleb, Abby." His voice was the particular kind of quiet that meant he was not going to argue about this. "Those men stop you. They take the evidence and it's finished. Everything Jonas died for is finished. Go with Jonah. I'll catch up." The 4 riders were in the water now. "If you're not behind us in 20 minutes, she said, "I'm coming back." "You won't need to." She held his eyes for 1 second. Then she turned her horse and rode. She rode hard, and she counted to herself not to manage fear, but because counting was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking on the reins. She counted to 60, then 60 again, then a 3rd time, and on the 4th minute she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned her head. And Caleb was there, his horse dark with river water, his face composed, moving fast. "2 of them went north," he said, pulling alongside. 2 turned back. "What did you do?" "Talk to them," he said. She looked at the fresh split across his knuckles. "Mostly talked," he said. Jonah riding ahead made the sound again, the almost laugh closer to real this time. They didn't stop until Helena. Helena was everything Dust Creek wasn't. Wide streets, a brick courthouse, hotels with proper glass windows, a telegraph office with a line that actually reached the outside world. Abby had imagined arriving here under different circumstances, in a different dress, without river water soaking her hem, and 12 sheets of paper folded against her skin, and 2 days of dry country riding in her bones. She didn't have time to care about any of that. "Territorial courthouse," she said before they'd even fully stopped. "That's where the judge sits." "Abby." Caleb's voice had a careful note in it. "Before we go in, there's something you need to know. Purdy left Dust Creek 3 days ago. If he rode hard, he's already been here." "I know." "If the judge has already received his petition, then we unreceive it," she said. She swung down from her horse. "Come on." They were halfway up the courthouse steps when the door opened and Gerald Fitch walked out. She knew him from the photograph he'd sent with his 3rd letter, a careful, prosperous-looking man of 45 with neat hair and the kind of well-maintained face that speaks of regular meals and no particular suffering. He stopped on the top step and looked at her, and his expression moved through surprise recognition, relief, and then something more complicated and more alarming, all in the space of about 2 seconds. "Abigail," he said. "Thank God. I've been there were reports that something had happened in Dust Creek and I—" He stopped, looked at Caleb, looked at Jonah, looked back at her. "Who are these men?" "Friends," she said. "Gerald, I need to speak with the territorial judge. Immediately." "Of course, yes, I can arrange." He was already moving toward her, hand extended, the automatic gestures of a man reclaiming a situation. "Come. Let me take you inside. You look exhausted. There's a parlor where you can—" "Gerald." She stopped moving. "Why are you at the territorial courthouse?" He paused. "I had business here. A property matter." "What property?" "Mining rights in the North Valley. A business associate of mine has been developing—" He stopped again. Something in her face had told him to stop. "Abigail, you look unwell. Let me—" "Your business associate," she said. "Is his name Silas Vane?" The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. She counted. "I have a minor investment," he said. His voice had changed, still controlled, but careful now in a new way. "A very minor, Gerald." She kept her voice level. Perfectly, absolutely level, the way she'd kept it in front of Holt, and in front of Vane himself, because level was the only register that worked when you were the smallest person in the room, and you needed to be the most powerful one. "Your name appears 3 times in Silas Vane's financial records as a paying partner in a scheme that has defrauded 19 families of their land, poisoned water access for an entire valley, and resulted in the death of at least 1 man in the past 24 hours. She paused. "Is there anything you'd like to tell me before I walk into that courthouse?" Gerald Fitch looked at her for a long time. Then he looked past her at Caleb, who was standing one step below and slightly behind her left shoulder, with his arms at his sides and his face completely still. "Who is this man?" Fitch asked again. "I told you," she said. "A friend." Fitch looked back at her, and in his face she saw the moment he made his calculation, the same kind of calculation Vane made the cost and leverage arithmetic of a man who had built his life on knowing which way things were going to fall and positioning himself accordingly. "I think," Gerald Fitch said slowly, "that you should come with me and rest before you say anything further. You've had a difficult journey, and I think, Mr. Fitch." Caleb's voice came from behind her. Quiet. Final. "The lady said she needs to speak with the judge." Fitch looked at him. Something passed between them, the specific, wordless communication of a man who understands he is not going to win this particular moment. He stepped aside. The judge's name was Arthur Kemper. He was 60, white-haired, with the patient eyes of a man who had been sitting in a territorial courthouse long enough to have seen most of what human beings were capable of, and had stopped being surprised by most of it. He received them in his office, and he listened to Purdy's name with a slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his expression that told Abby the petition had already arrived. "The petition was filed 2 days ago," he said. "It's under review." "I'd like to present contradicting evidence," Abby said. "You are Abigail Whitaker. I've been a resident of Dust Creek Valley for the past 8 days. She reached into the folds of her skirt and produced the 12 sheets slightly damp at the edges from the river crossing, otherwise intact. She set them on the desk in front of him. "These are copied records from Silas Vane's private business ledger. They document fraudulent debt collection against 19 Valley families, forged loan agreements, falsified land transfer documents, and a pattern of price inflation designed to force those families into default. Additionally," she reached back and Jonah stepped forward with his father's ledger, the one that had lived under a barn floorboard for 6 months. "This is an independent record maintained by Jonas Bell, a Valley resident documenting his own payments to Vane's supply company against Vane's claimed outstanding balance. The two records contradict each other at every point." Judge Kemper had put on his spectacles. He was looking at the papers. "Additionally," Abby continued, 3 of the 12 signatures on Purdy's water rights petition belong to men who have been dead for over a year. I can provide their names. I expect you can verify their deaths through territorial records." The judge looked up. "You can name them." Thomas Aldridge died March of 1875 pneumonia. Carol Whitmore died November of 1875 ranch accident. Price Hardened died January of 1876 heart failure. She held his eyes. "If you'd like, I can also explain how I know, which will involve telling you where I spent the past 2 nights, which will, in turn, explain the condition of my dress." Judge Kemper looked at the papers for a long moment. Then he looked at Jonah, who had been standing quietly to the side with his father's ledger held in both hands, and something in the judge's face shifted the slight loosening that happens when a man of conscience sees something he can no longer decline to see. "These forged signatures," Kemper said. "You're certain?" "I saw the petition myself for 30 seconds, she said. "I have a good memory for names. And I have reason to be very certain about the names of the dead because one of them is the father of the boy standing in this room who died last night, helping us bring you this evidence." The room was quiet. Jonah didn't move. His face held the particular stillness of a person who has accepted that their grief is not private, that it belongs to this moment and to the argument being made, and who has chosen to let that be so. Judge Kemper took off his spectacles. He set them on the desk. He looked at Caleb, who had said nothing since entering the office, who had simply stood slightly behind Abby's right shoulder, the way he'd stood at the boarding house and the courthouse steps, not protecting her exactly, witnessing her. There was a difference. "Mr. Rourke," the judge said, "you can corroborate this testimony." "All of it," Caleb said, "and add some. Specifically, Silas Vane has been using my past cooperation from 2 years ago when I worked as his scout as leverage to keep me from speaking against him. I have first-hand knowledge of his methods, his false lawyer, and his control over the county sheriff." He paused. I'm prepared to state all of that under oath." Kemper looked at all three of them in turn. Then he looked at the 12 sheets on his desk. "I'll need time to verify the death records," he said. "How much time?" Abby asked. "By tomorrow morning," he said. He picked up the papers. "I'll also need to review these in full tonight." He stood. "Where are you staying?" "We don't have accommodations," she said. He looked at her at the river-damp dress, the 2-day exhaustion she hadn't quite been able to keep entirely off her face. "There's a hotel 2 streets north. Tell them I sent you." He paused at his own office door. "Miss Whitaker." She looked at him. "Purdy left this office 2 days ago believing this petition was as good as approved," he said. He was not wrong to believe that. He held her gaze steadily. "He is wrong now." He closed the door behind him. Abby stood in the empty office for a moment, the particular stillness of a person who has been moving at full speed for 3 days and has suddenly run out of immediate things to do. She felt the exhaustion arrive in a wave, the kind that had been waiting politely at the edges of everything, and was now walking through the front door. Caleb's hand closed around hers, not reaching for it, not searching. Just there, steady, certain in the way of someone who knows exactly where he's putting his hand and why. She didn't look at him. She just held on. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's different than it was this morning." Jonah was looking at the window, at Helena, at the town his father had never reached. "He would have liked to see this," Jonah said quietly. "He did see it," Abby said. "He saw it when he got up from that barn floor and walked back into town with you. That was him seeing it." She released Caleb's hand and turned to face Jonah directly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, your father's name will be on the right side of these records. Every document that goes to that judge has your family's ledger beside it. Jonas Bell will be part of why Silas Vane is stopped." Jonah looked at her. His eyes were bright in the way of someone who is not going to cry in front of people, but is fully aware that the option exists. "Yes, ma'am," he said, for the 3rd time. But this time it didn't sound like agreement. It sounded like something he was keeping. Outside, Helena moved through its ordinary evening people. Horses, the smell of cook fires, the ordinary business of a town that didn't know yet what was coming back toward it. Abby stood in a borrowed judge's office, with river water still drying in the hem of her skirt, and 12 sheets of evidence already in the hands of a man who had just told her he was going to read them, and she thought about Dust Creek, about Martha, about the padlock on the well, about Emmett Garfield's hay burning in the dark. She thought about $23 in a tin on a shelf above a stove, offered without hesitation by a woman who had been tired for 14 years and had decided tonight to stop being tired. By morning, the judge would have his verification. By morning, the dead men's names would be confirmed in the territorial death records. And when Purdy's forged petition collapsed under its own fraud, Gerald Fitch's investment in Silas Vane's operation would collapse with it, not because Abby intended to destroy him, but because the numbers didn't care about intention. The numbers said what they said. The judge would send marshals. She was sure of it now. But first, a bed, a meal, and 8 hours of sleep in that order without negotiation. She turned to Caleb and Jonah. "Come on," she said. "Let's go find that hotel." Judge Kemper's clerk came to the hotel at 7 in the morning. Abby was already awake, had been awake since 5, sitting at the small writing table by the window, going through her copied columns one more time. The way you check a sum you already know is right, not because you doubt it, but because the stakes are high enough that certainty is worth the extra hour. She heard the knock, and was at the door before Caleb, who was in the adjoining room, had time to respond to it. The clerk was young, efficient, and slightly breathless in the manner of someone who has been moving quickly since before breakfast. "Judge Kemper presents his compliments," he said. "The death records have been verified. All 3 names. He asks that you come to the courthouse at 8. "Tell him we'll be there at 7:30, she said. The clerk blinked. "He said 8, ma'am, and I said 7:30, Abby said pleasantly. Because every additional 30 minutes that petition sits uncontested is 30 minutes Silas Vane has to move assets. Tell the judge I respectfully suggest we not give him the time." The clerk looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, turned and went back the way he'd come, slightly faster than he'd arrived. Caleb appeared in the connecting doorway. He'd heard all of it. "7:30, he said. "7:30, she confirmed. Something in his face, that shadow of a thing that lived just behind the careful stillness, came very close to the surface. "You know," he said, "for a woman who came west looking for a quiet life, you are exceptionally bad at it." "I never said I was looking for a quiet life," she said. "I said I was looking for a floor." He looked at her. "Did you find one?" She held his gaze for one moment. Then she picked up her papers and her coat and said, "Let's go get your valley back." "But Gerald Fitch was waiting on the courthouse steps at 7:25. He had clearly been there for some time. He had the stiff posture of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say through a sleepless night, and arrived early to make sure he gets to say it first. He straightened when he saw her coming, and came down 2 steps with his hat in his hands. "Abigail," he said, "I need to speak with you before you go in." "Gerald?" She stopped at the base of the steps. "I'd like you to think carefully before you speak, because anything you say in the next 2 minutes will either help you or damage you in front of a territorial judge, and I don't think you've quite decided which direction you'd prefer." He blinked. "I know what you want," she said. "You want to know if your name can be kept out of this. You want to know if the 3 payments you made to Silas Vane's operation can be characterized as passive investment rather than knowing participation." She tilted her head slightly. "Here is what I can tell you, Gerald. If you walk into that courthouse today and give Judge Kemper a full account of everything you know about Vane's operation, every payment, every conversation, every piece of information you were given about what that money was being used for, you have a chance at being treated as a witness rather than a participant. If you don't—" She paused. "Your name is in those records regardless. The choice is only about what context surrounds it." Gerald Fitch looked at her with the expression of a man who had written 3 careful letters to a woman he'd expected to be grateful and biddable, and had received something considerably different. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine I am." He put his hat back on his head. He looked at the courthouse door. He was quiet for long enough that Jonah, standing slightly behind Abby, shifted his weight. "I'll talk to Kemper," Fitch said finally. His voice had lost its careful, prosperous quality. He just sounded tired. "I'll tell him everything I know." "Good," she said. She moved past him up the steps. "For what it's worth, Gerald, I think you're a man who made a bad investment and kept making it because admitting a mistake is harder than pretending it isn't one. That's a human failing. It doesn't have to be the last thing you do." She didn't wait to see his expression. She pushed through the courthouse door and went inside. Judge Kemper had 5 federal marshals in his office by 9 o'clock. They were solid, deliberate men, in the way of people whose job is to go into difficult places and restore order, and they listened to Kemper's summary and then to Abby's account with the focused attention of people who are building a picture and checking it for gaps. The senior marshal, a man named Doyle, with a gray-streaked beard and 20 years of territorial service, asked 12 specific questions, all of them good ones. And when Abby answered the 12th, he looked at Kemper and nodded once. "We ride this afternoon," Doyle said. "Purdy," Abby said. "He's somewhere between here and Dust Creek." "We'll find him," Doyle said. He looked at her with a kind of measured respect, the kind that doesn't come easily and doesn't come cheap. "You said you copied all of this from memory." "Most of it," she said. "I had the originals for 2 nights. I have a good memory." "So I gather." He stood. "Ma'am, in 20 years of this work, I've had evidence presented to me by sheriffs, lawyers, and judges. I don't believe I've ever had it presented by a schoolteacher from Philadelphia who hid it in her petticoat." He said it completely straight-faced. "It's an effective delivery method." Jonah, for the first time since his father died, laughed. A real one, brief and startled out of him, and he looked almost guilty about it, and then looked less guilty. And Abby thought that Jonas Bell would have been glad to hear that sound come out of his son. They rode back to Dust Creek that afternoon. Abby, Caleb, Jonah, and 5 federal marshals strung out along the dry country route in a line that moved with the quiet, certain momentum of something that cannot be stopped by the people who most want to stop it. They arrived on the 3rd morning. Vane knew they were coming before they hit the valley road. Abby later understood that a man like Silas Vane had contingencies, and she should have assumed he had a rider watching the Helena approach. But she didn't understand it yet when they rode into Dust Creek and found him standing in front of the supply company with his arms folded and Deputy Holt beside him, and 4 of his men arranged with the particular casualness of armed people who are trying to appear casual. He looked at the 5 marshals. He looked at Abby. His face was composed in the way of someone who has decided on an expression and is committed to it. "Marshal Doyle," he said, "I've been expecting a visit." "Silas Vane," Doyle said, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, extortion, and conspiracy." He reached into his coat. "Signed by Territorial Judge Arthur Kemper this morning." "I'm sure you do," Vane said pleasantly. He unfolded his arms. He turned and looked at Holt, and in that look something passed between them, a communication brief and specific, the kind between men who have worked together long enough to talk without words. Holt reached up and unpinned the deputy badge from his chest. He held it in his palm for a moment looking at it. Then he looked at Doyle. "I'd like to speak to someone," Holt said. "About what I know. About all of it." His voice had dropped the official flatness. He just sounded like a man. "Vane has a record on me. Something from 8 years ago. It's why I—" He stopped. "I'd like to speak to someone." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Vane looked at Holt with an expression that was for the first time since Abby had come to Dust Creek not calculated. It was something rawer and colder, the expression of a man watching something he built fall apart from the inside. "You don't have to honor a blackmailer's leverage," Abby said to Holt, quietly. "Not anymore." Holt looked at her. He nodded once. He stepped away from Vane's side. Doyle's men moved. Vane went quietly. He was that kind of man, the kind who understood when a moment had passed and adapted immediately to the next one. He was already thinking ahead. She could see it in his eyes as they put the cuffs on him, already calculating the lawyers in Helena and the judges he might reach and the assets he might protect. "Miss Whitaker," he said as they walked him past her. He stopped just for a second, Doyle's men pausing with him. "You should know. The deed transfers to Bell's land. The Garfield land, 7 others. I filed them yesterday morning with the Territorial Land Office, under a holding company name." He almost smiled. "It'll take years to untangle in court." She looked at him steadily. "The 3 payments Gerald Fitch made to your operation," she said. "They're on your ledger as payments to the same holding company, dated 6 months ago, which predates the land transfers by 8 months. She paused. "Which means the holding company can be traced back through Fitch's records to you personally before the transfers were made. Which means the transfers are fraudulent conveyances, not legitimate sales." She held his eyes. "It won't take years. It'll take a good lawyer about 6 weeks. Silas Vane looked at her. Something moved through his face. Not defeat, not yet, but the first real acknowledgement that he was dealing with something he had genuinely underestimated. Doyle's men walked him on. Martha's boarding house had been partially burned, not destroyed. The back rooms and the kitchen were intact, and Martha herself was standing in front of it with a bucket and the expression of a woman who has been angry before and knows that anger is a fuel, not a feeling, and intends to use it accordingly. She saw Abby and put the bucket down. She crossed the distance between them, and she put both arms around Abby without saying anything, and Abby stood in Martha Pike's arms and felt 14 years of this town's exhaustion and stubbornness and determination in the grip of them, and she didn't say anything either, because some things don't need language to be said completely. "You came back," Martha said, finally pulling away. "I told you I would." People say a lot of things. Martha looked at her steadily. "You did it." "We did it," Abby said. "All of us." Martha looked past her at Caleb, at Jonah, at the 5 federal marshals visible down the street, at Emmett Garfield already crossing toward them from the direction of the feed store, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who has been waiting and is done waiting, at the padlock on the well, which one of Doyle's men had already cut with a bolt cutter, because removing illegal control of water access was apparently the first thing federal marshals did when they arrived in a valley, and Abby thought that was exactly right. "Come inside," Martha said. "I still have a kitchen." Meg. The days that followed were not clean or simple or easy. Recovery never is. People who have been afraid for a long time don't stop being afraid the moment the thing that frightened them is gone. They stop incrementally in layers the way ice thaws, beginning at the edges and working inward. The families in Dust Creek had been living inside Silas Vane's particular version of reality for 2 years. And reality takes time to rebuild. But they rebuilt it. Emmett Garfield reopened his feed store within the week and charged the prices written in his own hand on his own ledger, not the inflated numbers that had appeared in Vane's books. And the first morning he opened the door, he had 11 customers waiting, which was more than he'd had in 8 months. The Garfield and Bell land transfers were invalidated within 3 weeks, exactly 18 days, because the lawyer Kemper appointed was a careful man who read the Fitch payment records exactly the way Abby had predicted, and found the fraudulent conveyance argument exactly as solid as she'd said it would be. Jonah Bell took his father's 40 acres and worked them. He was 15, and the land was more than one boy could manage alone. And Caleb spent every third weekend for the rest of that summer riding out to the Bell farm and helping and not discussing it. And Jonah didn't discuss it either, and that was the right way for it to be. Gerald Fitch testified. He told Kemper everything. The investment, the conversations, the pieces he'd told himself he didn't fully understand because understanding fully would have required him to act. The judge treated him as a witness. He returned to Helena, and Abby never spoke to him again, and neither of them pretended that was not the right outcome. Holt talked too. He talked for 4 hours in Kemper's office, and what he said filled gaps in the evidence that even Abby's memory hadn't covered. And when he was done, Kemper considered the blackmail record and the coercion, and gave Holt something that wasn't quite forgiveness, and wasn't quite exoneration, but was a path forward, which is sometimes all the justice that's available, and sometimes is enough. Purdy was found on the road to Helena. He had the original petition in his saddlebag, and 4 other documents that turned out to contain 3 more forgeries that no one in Dust Creek had known about. The Missouri bar confirmed his fraudulent credentials within 2 weeks. He went to a federal holding facility in Bozeman and was not heard from again in any meaningful way. Silas Vane went to trial in October. Abby was not there for it. She had other things to do, but Caleb sent her a letter with the result, and the result was 17 years, and she read it twice and set it down and went back to work. She had been in Dust Creek for 6 weeks when Caleb came to find her at the building that was becoming the school. It wasn't a school yet. It was 4 walls and a partial roof, and the framework of something, the kind of raw, unfinished thing that only becomes what it's supposed to be if someone with a clear picture of it keeps showing up every day and adding to it. She'd been coming every morning since the 2nd week, gathering supplies where she could find them, and persuading people to donate lumber and time with the same methodical persistence she'd applied to everything else, and it was working slowly, the way slow things work. Caleb came in through the open doorway and looked at what she'd done and was quiet for a moment. "Water Council meets Thursday," he said. "They've asked if you'd sit on it." "I know," she said. "Martha told me." "Land Records office opens next week. Emmett's running it. He's asked if you'd check his accounting system." I told him I would. He was quiet again. She kept working, measuring the space for the first row of desks, because she'd decided there was no reason not to start calculating the practical things. "Abby," he said. She looked at him. He had his hat in his hands, which she had come to recognize as the position he adopted when he was going to say something he'd been thinking about for a while, and had decided to stop thinking about and just say, "I'm not going to ask you to marry me," he said. She blinked. "All right. Not yet. Maybe not for a while." He met her eyes directly the way he always did when the thing he was saying mattered. "Because I think if I ask you right now, it sounds like I'm asking you to belong to me, and that's not what I mean. What I mean is—" He stopped and started again in the way of a man who has rehearsed something and found that the rehearsed version is wrong, and the real version has to come out unrehearsed or not at all. "I've got a spring and 60 acres and a reputation that's somewhere between respected and complicated. You've got a mind that could run a small government and the most inconvenient moral courage I have ever encountered in another person." She almost smiled. "Is that a compliment?" "It's a fact," he said. "And my question, the thing I've been trying to figure out how to say for 6 weeks, is whether you want to build something with me. Not because I rescued you, not because you need me, because we're better at this." He gestured, meaning all of it, the school, the water council, the land records, the valley, the whole struggling, rebuilding, slowly healing thing, together than either of us is alone. The room was quiet. Outside she could hear Dust Creek real sounds daily. Sounds a horse and someone calling to someone else, and the particular creak of Emmett's newly rehung feed store sign. Alive sounds. The sounds of a town that had been half strangled and was breathing again. She looked at Caleb Rourke, this careful, still complicated man who had spent 2 years keeping his head down and hating himself for it, and had chosen the moment someone showed him it was possible to choose differently, to choose differently. Who had put himself between her and Holt on her second day here, and between Jonas Bell and Vane's men on her third, and between her and the darkness of a Montana mine tunnel on a night she would carry for the rest of her life? Who had lit the second lamp so she could read? "Partnership," she said. "Equal," he said. "In every sense, I know how to mean that word." She set down the measuring tape. She walked to where he was standing, and she looked up at him, and she said, "I came west looking for a floor and a man who could pay my passage." "I know," he said. "I found something considerably more complicated." "I know that too." "Yes," she said. "Caleb Rourke, yes. Let's build the valley." He exhaled the specific full exhale of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time and has finally set it down. He reached out and took her hand, both hands the way you hold something you intend to keep, and he nodded once the way he nodded when something was final and right and done. Outside, Dust Creek went on living. Jonah Bell would come back to school in the fall, the school that was 4 walls and a partial roof today, and would be a proper building by September, because Abigail Whitaker had never in her life started something she didn't finish. Martha Pike would sit on the Water Council and say exactly what needed to be said with the blunt, tireless honesty of a woman who had been holding her tongue for 14 years and was done with that. Emmett Garfield's ledger would have real numbers in it, his numbers honest and plain, the kind that a man can read at the end of the year and feel right about. And Abby would stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go, not because Caleb asked her, not because the circumstances left her no choice. She had a choice. She had always had a choice. She stayed because Dust Creek Valley had shown her something she'd stopped believing was available to a woman alone and 34, and arriving at the end of a long string of narrowing options, that a life built on purpose, on usefulness, on the kind of work that holds a community together, when everything tries to pull it apart, was not just possible. It was the only life worth building. Abigail Whitaker had come west looking for protection. She found injustice instead, and she became exactly the kind of woman who made sure it never came back.